They shared the same blood in the same childhood bedroom, yet became sworn enemies for 80 years. On one side, a revered, dignified icon of classical Hollywood. On the other, a brilliant, Oscar-winning outcast heavily burdened by paranoia. The tragedy of Olivia de Havilland and Joan Fontaine was engineered by a toxic mother and monetized by a ruthless studio machine. How did the very institutions meant to protect these women, family and film, turn two sisters into cold strangers until the day they died? The origins of the hostility trace back to the British expatriate community in Tokyo during the First World War. Walter de Havilland, an English patent attorney with aristocratic lineage and a Cambridge education, married Lillian Augusta Roos. Lillian possessed a formidable intellect and an intense, entirely unfulfilled ambition for the stage. She had studied at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art in London, mastering classical techniques and vocal projection, but marriage and a relocation to the Far East had abruptly suffocated her theatrical aspirations. Olivia Mary was born in 1916, a robust, healthy child who immediately absorbed her mother's focus. 15 months later, Joan de Beauvoir arrived. From the moment of Joan's birth, a rigid hierarchy was established. Olivia was the favored firstborn. Joan was frail, plagued by severe illnesses, including rheumatic fever and chronic pleurisy, which kept her isolated and dependent. The marriage between Walter and Lillian disintegrated rapidly amidst Walter's infidelities, prompting Lillian to execute a strategic retreat. In 1919, she moved her young daughters across the Pacific to Saratoga, California. In Saratoga, Lillian Fontaine transformed her household into a miniature production company. Stripped of a traditional stage, she directed her household with absolute authority. She recognized her own thwarted ambitions in her daughters and began a rigorous program of diction, elocution, and dramatic training. Crucially, Lillian applied a brutal casting system to her children. Olivia was designated the leading lady. She was praised for her beauty, her sharp mind, and her assertive nature. Lillian groomed Olivia for greatness, projecting all her own lost potential onto the elder daughter. Joan was cast firmly as the understudy. She was positioned as the frail, inferior backup, assigned domestic chores, while Olivia rehearsed Shakespearean monologues. Lillian employed psychological triangulation with surgical precision, communicating affection to one daughter exclusively at the expense of the other. She created an environment of artificial scarcity where maternal approval was a prize to be won through fierce, uncompromising competition. The psychological toll on Joan was immense. She grew up in an atmosphere where her very existence felt like an inconvenience to the primary narrative of Olivia's impending stardom. The physical manifestations of this stress were frequent. Joan spent years confined to her bed, an invalid whose medical needs drained the family's resources and further alienated her mother. Lillian often viewed Joan's illnesses as a personal affront, a distraction from the crucial work of molding Olivia. Olivia, in turn, internalized her mother's disdain for weakness. Emboldened by blatant favoritism, she adopted Lillian's dismissive attitude toward her younger sister. The siblings frequently clashed, their arguments escalating from verbal abuse to physical violence. In her autobiography, No Bed of Roses, Joan recounted a chilling incident by the family swimming pool. During a heated altercation, Joan claimed Olivia threw her to the ground with such force that she suffered a fractured collarbone. Olivia, however, strongly disputed this narrative. Regardless of the exact truth, this hostility was entirely foundational. Joan documented her own despair early on. At the age of 9, consumed by powerlessness and rage, She drafted a mock last will and testament. Hidden within this childhood document was a meticulously detailed plan to murder her sister. It was the desperate psychological output of a child trapped in a domestic war zone, fully aware that she was losing the battle for survival. The ultimate act of psychological severance occurred when the Hollywood machinery finally noticed the de Havilland household. In the mid-1930s, Olivia achieved immediate and massive success. Discovered by the legendary Austrian theater director Max Reinhardt, she was cast in his spectacular Hollywood Bowl production of A Midsummer Night's Dream. Her performance led directly to a film adaptation and a restrictive, lucrative 7-year contract at Warner Brothers. Jack Warner, a notorious studio autocrat, immediately recognized her commercial value. She became an international sensation, the designated romantic foil for the swashbuckling Errol Flynn in a string of highly profitable adventure films. The home studio's leading lady had conquered the actual studios. Lillian's vision was vindicated, but the domestic equilibrium shattered when Joan decided that she, too, wanted to pursue acting. When Joan announced her intentions to enter the film industry, the reaction from Lillian and Olivia was swift and uncompromising. They issued a mandate. The name de Havilland belonged exclusively to Olivia. There could be only one star bearing the family crest. If Joan wished to act, she would be strictly forbidden from capitalizing on her sister's established fame. Furthermore, her mother had remarried a stern, authoritarian businessman named George Fontaine. Joan was forced to abandon her aristocratic birth name and adopt the surname of her deeply unpopular stepfather. Stripped of her family identity, she entered the industry as Joan Fontaine. This was a profound, calculated act of erasure. It signaled to the world, and to Joan herself, that she was an outsider, an imposter who possessed no legitimate claim to the family's artistic legacy. Joan was effectively exiled to the lower tiers of the studio system, while Olivia was navigating the complex politics of A-list stardom at Warner Brothers, wearing elaborate period costumes and fighting Jack Warner for substantial dramatic roles. Joan was grinding through low-budget B-movies at RKO Pictures. They were operating in the same industry, living in the same city, yet separated by an unbridgeable gulf of status and resentment. The powder keg had been completely filled by Lillian's machinations. Both women were hypervigilant, deeply insecure, and desperate for validation. They had been programmed from infancy to view any victory for the other as a direct existential threat. The domestic arena had reached its absolute limit. The conflict was primed to spill over into the public domain, requiring only an external catalyst to ignite a permanent conflagration. That catalyst would not come from within the family, but from a man who possessed enough wealth and arrogance to treat human lives as a parlor game. The industrial reality of late 1930s Hollywood provided the perfect pressurized environment for this deeply rooted domestic trauma to detonate. The studio system operated strictly as a rigid top-down manufacturing sector. Actors were not employees. They were heavily leveraged corporate assets. At Warner Brothers, Olivia de Havilland found herself trapped in a spectacularly gilded cage. Jack L. Warner, the studio's fiercely combative executive, controlled every aspect of her professional existence. Her 7-year contract dictated what she wore, who she spoke to, and precisely which scripts she was legally obligated to memorize. Olivia was highly lucrative, frequently paired with Errol Flynn in sweeping historical epics like Captain Blood and the Adventures of Robin Hood. Yet she was creatively suffocated, routinely forced into the repetitive role of the passive decorative maiden waiting to be rescued. When she rebelled and demanded complex dramatic material, Warner utilized the standard industry punishment: suspension without pay. She was barred from working anywhere else, her career effectively placed in solitary confinement until she surrendered. Olivia possessed the iron will of her mother, Lillian, and she fought Warner constantly, but she was fundamentally isolated within an infrastructure designed to break an actor's autonomy. Just a few miles away, Joan Fontaine occupied a completely different stratum of this industrial hierarchy. Relegated to minor roles at RKO Pictures, she was churning out B-movies and struggling to establish a foothold in a town that already worshipped her older sister. Joan carried the heavy psychological burden of her forced name change. The studio publicity machines, heavily reliant on manufacturing digestible narratives for the public, largely ignored her. She was a peripheral figure, lacking the institutional protection and the massive promotional budgets that shielded Olivia. This disparity in status only reinforced the childhood dynamic established in Saratoga. Olivia remained the victorious leading lady, while Joan was still the neglected understudy, waiting in the wings of a soundstage. They were two women highly vulnerable to external manipulation, their insecurities polished to a razor edge by the relentless pressure of the cinematic factory town. Into this volatile ecosystem stepped a man perfectly equipped to exploit their psychological fractures. Billionaire industrialist and aviation pioneer Howard Hughes operated as a compulsive collector of famous women. He operated with the unlimited resources of inherited wealth and the absolute moral detachment of a predator. Hughes viewed human relationships purely as acquisitions and mergers. He maintained a vast secretive network of private investigators, fixers, and studio executives to monitor the movements of the actresses he targeted. By 1938, his surveillance apparatus had locked onto Olivia de Havilland. Hughes initiated a relentless, highly publicized courtship. He bombarded her dressing room with massive floral arrangements, arranged for private flights on his customized aircraft, and offered her the illusion of escape from Jack Warner's tyrannical oversight. Olivia, deeply frustrated by her studio battles and perhaps flattered by the sheer scale of the attention, engaged with him. Yet historical accounts suggest she maintained a degree of wariness, recognizing the transactional nature of his affection and refusing to completely capitulate to his controlling demands. Hughes possessed a profound intolerance for being denied. He was a man who thrived on creating chaos and observing the fallout. If he could not secure Olivia's absolute submission, he would pivot to a strategy designed to inflict maximum psychological disruption. He immediately targeted the de Havilland family's deepest fracture, their sibling rivalry. Hughes understood triangulation just as intuitively as Lillian Fontaine did. He recognized that the most effective way to punish the elder sister was to suddenly elevate the younger one. The perfect opportunity presented itself in 1939, centered around an impending marriage that was already laden with bizarre psychological baggage. Joan Fontaine was engaged to be married to Brian Aherne, a respected British actor who was 15 years her senior. The marriage itself was a subconscious continuation of the family's competitive warfare, as Aherne had previously been romantically involved with Olivia. By marrying her sister's former suitor, Joan was executing a quiet, devastating maneuver, claiming a prize that Olivia had discarded or lost. The tension surrounding the wedding was already palpable. During a glittering high society party held just before the ceremony, Howard Hughes decided to strike. He arrived at the event solely as a disruptive agent. He bypassed Olivia entirely and approached Joan on the dance floor. As they danced, the billionaire leaned in and delivered a proposition that stripped away any pretense of romance. According to Joan's later recollections, he issued what sounded like a direct corporate buyout. He told her to cancel the wedding immediately. He offered to pay Brian Aherney whatever financial sum was necessary to make him disappear. He then bluntly stated, "Don't marry Aherney, marry me." Hughes was fully aware that he was holding a lit match over a barrel of gasoline. He was propositioning the bride-to-be, who happened to be the bitterly estranged sister of the woman he was currently dating, offering her access to an empire of wealth and power that would instantly eclipse Olivia's standing in Hollywood. Joan was paralyzed by the encounter. Her lifelong fear of powerful authoritarian figures, cultivated by her mother and exacerbated by the studio system, caused her to panic. She fled the dance floor, deeply disturbed by the predatory nature of the offer. Seeking refuge and perhaps a rare moment of familial solidarity, she recounted the entire incident to Olivia and Lillian. The reaction she received permanently cemented the hostility between the sisters. Rather than condemning the billionaire for his breathtaking arrogance or his blatant attempt to sabotage a wedding, Olivia turned the full force of her fury onto Joan. Olivia accused her sister of deliberately seducing Hughes. She fell back entirely on the programming Lillian had installed years prior. Joan was the usurper, the deceitful understudy constantly trying to steal the leading lady's spotlight. In Olivia's mind, Hughes was a victim of Joan's manipulation, not the instigator of a cruel psychological game. This reaction represented a total systemic failure of sisterhood. It proved that Lillian's architecture of division was impenetrable. Hughes had successfully deployed a single whispered sentence to detonate the remaining shreds of their relationship. He walked away from the wreckage, having achieved his goal of destabilizing them both, leaving behind a family that was now entirely incapable of trusting one another. The private war had reached its climax just as the professional landscape shifted dramatically, providing a massive public arena for their mutual destruction. In late 1939, Hollywood was consumed by the search for the lead actress in the film adaptation of Daphne du Maurier's Gothic thriller, Rebecca. Independent producer David O. Selznick had secured the rights and hired the brilliant British director Alfred Hitchcock to make his American debut. The role of the unnamed narrator, the second Mrs. De Winter, was the most coveted part in the industry. The character required a highly specific emotional register, profound insecurity, paralyzing self-doubt, and a desperate desire to please an imposing, withholding authority figure. It was a role that demanded an actress who deeply understood the mechanics of emotional subjugation. Naturally, Lillian Fontaine decreed that the role belonged to Olivia. Olivia campaigned aggressively for the part, viewing it as the perfect vehicle to escape the swashbuckling adventures at Warner Brothers. She delivered a phenomenal audition, and Hitchcock was reportedly eager to cast her. She possessed the talent, the rising star power, and the classical training required for the prestigious production. But the studio system's ironclad legal structure intervened. Jack L. Warner absolutely refused to loan his most valuable female asset to a rival producer. Warner knew that if Olivia secured a massive, critically acclaimed hit outside of his studio, she would return with undeniable leverage, demanding more money and script approval. He vetoed the arrangement without a second thought. Olivia's own success and the punitive nature of her contract had locked her out of the role of a lifetime. David O. Selznick was a notoriously obsessive and demanding producer, but he was also a pragmatist facing a ballooning budget. He needed a leading lady who was highly capable but lacked the exorbitant price tag and the legal entanglements of an established A-list star. He needed someone vulnerable and easily controllable. He turned his attention to the periphery of the Hollywood establishment. He turned to Joan Fontaine. Joan, untethered by a restrictive long-term contract and desperate for a breakthrough, was brought in for a screen test. When she stepped in front of the camera, she did not have to act the part of the terrified, overshadowed understudy. She simply existed in the emotional state she had inhabited since birth. She channeled the decades of maternal rejection, the paralyzing fear of her sister's shadow, and the fresh trauma of the Howard Hughes incident directly into the lens. Selznick and Hitchcock recognized immediately that they had found their victim. They cast her. Film historians often note how this toxic upbringing forged two entirely different cinematic techniques. Olivia, the groomed leading lady, possessed a classical, highly controlled precision. Her performances were pieces of intellectual architecture. Joan, conversely, operated on raw, nervous instinct. Her vulnerability on screen wasn't purely acted. It was the visceral projection of a lifelong understudy. Hitchcock did not just cast an actress. He captured a psychological state. The production of Rebecca became a masterclass in psychological manipulation, perfectly mirroring the abusive dynamics of the de Havilland household. Hitchcock, a director renowned for his cruel treatment of actors, weaponized Joan's real-life insecurities to extract the performance he needed. He systematically isolated her on the set. He informed her, entirely falsely, that the rest of the cast and crew despised her. He told her that her co-star, Laurence Olivier, actively wanted her fired and replaced by his own partner, Vivien Leigh. Hitchcock recreated the exact emotional architecture of Joan's childhood, a hostile environment where a powerful director dictated her worth, where she was positioned as an unwanted interloper, and where she was constantly threatened with replacement by a more favored, beautiful woman. The strategy was brutally effective. Joan's performance in Rebecca was a raw, agonizing portrait of anxiety. It was less a technical display of acting and more an authentic documentary of a woman collapsing under psychological pressure. When the film was released in 1940, it was a massive critical and commercial triumph. Joan Fontaine was instantly catapulted from RKO B movies to the absolute pinnacle of Hollywood royalty. She received an Academy Award nomination for Best Actress, securing the very first Oscar nomination in the history of the family. The power dynamic, carefully constructed by Lillian and enforced by Olivia for 24 years, was instantly and violently obliterated. The understudy had not just stepped into the spotlight, she had stolen the entire stage. The resulting resentment permanently shattered the family. Olivia, trapped at Warner Brothers making films she despised, had to watch her sister achieve international acclaim in the exact role she had been denied. Joan, finally holding tangible proof of her worth, found that success did not cure her fundamental insecurity but merely amplified her paranoia. The battle lines were permanently redrawn. There was no longer a leading lady and a backup. There were two heavyweights, operating at the peak of their industrial power, fully equipped and deeply motivated to destroy each other. The media, acting as the enforcement arm of the studio system, immediately recognized the commercial value of this hatred. The family tragedy was about to be syndicated. The Hollywood publicity machine of the early 1940s did not merely report on the lives of its stars, it actively engineered them. Once Joan Fontaine secured her Academy Award nomination for Rebecca, the private, toxic dynamic of the de Havilland household was forcefully dragged into the public arena. The studio system immediately recognized the immense commercial value of a legitimate blood feud. The industry was governed by gossip columnists like Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons, women who wielded absolute terrifying power over the box office. They operated as the unofficial enforcement arms of the studios, trading favorable coverage for exclusive access and punishing dissenters with career-ending blind items. Hopper and Parsons were not mere journalists. They were power brokers who could dictate box office receipts. According to studio archives, publicists would regularly leak embellished stories of the sisters' private arguments directly to these women. A standard weapon was the blind item, a vicious, unnamed rumor printed in the morning paper that everyone in town knew referred to Olivia or Joan. The targeted sister would feel compelled to issue a public rebuttal. In doing so, they effectively did the studio's promotional work for free. For Hopper and Parsons, the story of two aristocratic sisters locked in a bitter rivalry was a goldmine. The studios, specifically Warner Brothers, and Selznick International eagerly fed the columnists' fabricated rumors, exaggerated slights, and carefully curated quotes to keep the narrative burning. The sisters were forced to navigate a daily minefield where their deepest, most agonizing personal traumas were printed in bold type across millions of breakfast tables. Every audition, every dress, every romantic partner was immediately placed on a public scorecard. They were no longer allowed to simply be angry with each other in private. They were contractually obligated to perform their hatred for a paying audience. The conflict had been fully syndicated, turning their emotional survival into a highly profitable corporate asset. This manufactured escalation culminated in the winter of 1942, setting the stage for one of the most brutal public humiliations in Hollywood history. The 14th Academy Awards presented a scenario that not even a studio screenwriter could have pitched with a straight face. Both sisters were nominated for the industry's highest honor, the Academy Award for Best Actress. Olivia de Havilland had finally broken free of her swashbuckling corset long enough to secure a loan out to Paramount Pictures, delivering a luminous, heartbreaking performance as a naive schoolteacher in Hold Back the Dawn. Joan Fontaine, capitalizing on the neurotic momentum of Rebecca, was nominated for another Alfred Hitchcock psychological thriller, Suspicion, playing a wealthy heiress terrified that her charming husband is plotting to murder her. The industry was salivating. The Academy organizers, fully aware of the theatrical potential, seated the sisters at the exact same table at the Biltmore Hotel banquet. The physical proximity was a deliberate act of psychological cruelty. The air at the table was suffocating. Lillian Fontaine was also in attendance, basking in the unprecedented glory of having produced two nominees, the ultimate validation of her Saratoga training camp. Yet, the underlying tension was lethal. Olivia was the overwhelming favorite to win. She was the established star, the elder sister, the woman who had paid her dues in the Warner Brothers trenches. Even Joan reportedly believed that Olivia's victory was a foregone conclusion. The natural order of their childhood dictated that Olivia must win. When the presenter tore open the envelope, the resulting announcement effectively shattered the foundational law of their family. The winner was Joan Fontaine. The immediate aftermath at the table dissolved into profound psychological paralysis. According to multiple historical accounts and eyewitness testimonies, Joan physically froze. The sheer weight of the moment, the realization that she had just permanently usurped the golden child, triggered a massive internal crisis. Winning the Oscar meant she had committed the ultimate transgression against her mother's established hierarchy. She was terrified of the immediate retaliation. Beside her, Olivia demonstrated the immaculate aristocratic discipline that Lillian had drilled into her for 2 decades. Masking whatever devastation she felt beneath a professional smile, Olivia turned and graciously extended her hand to congratulate her younger sister. It was the precise expected gesture of a seasoned leading lady. What happened next became Hollywood legend. Joan, trapped in a trance of shock, guilt, and deep-seated fear, stood up and stared blankly ahead. She completely bypassed Olivia's outstretched hand. She did not meet her sister's eyes. She brushed past the gesture, leaving Olivia's hand suspended in midair in front of the entire industry elite. Toxic dynamic of the de Havilland household was forcefully dragged into the public arena. The studio system immediately recognized the immense commercial value of a legitimate blood feud. The industry was governed by gossip columnists like Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons, women who wielded absolute terrifying power over the box office. They operated as the unofficial enforcement arms of the studios, trading favorable coverage for exclusive access and punishing dissenters with career-ending blind items. Hopper and Parsons were not mere journalists. They were power brokers who could dictate box office receipts. According to studio archives, publicists would regularly leak embellished stories of the sisters' private arguments directly to these women. A standard weapon was the blind item, a vicious, unnamed rumor printed in the morning paper that everyone in town knew referred to Olivia or Joan. The targeted sister would feel compelled to issue a public rebuttal. In doing so, they effectively did the studio's promotional work for free. For Hopper and Parsons, the story of 2 aristocratic sisters locked in a bitter rivalry was a goldmine. The studios, specifically Warner Brothers, and Selznick International, eagerly fed the columnists fabricated rumors, exaggerated slights, and carefully curated quotes to keep the narrative burning. The sisters were forced to navigate a daily minefield where their deepest, most agonizing personal traumas were printed in bold type across millions of breakfast tables. Every audition, every dress, every romantic partner was immediately placed on a public scorecard. They were no longer allowed to simply be angry with each other in private. They were contractually obligated to perform their hatred for a paying audience. The conflict had been fully syndicated, turning their emotional survival into a highly profitable corporate asset. This manufactured escalation culminated in the winter of 1942, setting the stage for one of the most brutal public humiliations in Hollywood history. The 14th Academy Awards presented a scenario that not even a studio screenwriter could have pitched with a straight face. Both sisters were nominated for the industry's highest honor, the Academy Award for Best Actress. Olivia de Havilland had finally broken free of her swashbuckling corset long enough to secure a loan out to Paramount Pictures, delivering a luminous, heartbreaking performance as a naive schoolteacher in Hold Back the Dawn. Joan Fontaine, capitalizing on the neurotic momentum of Rebecca, was nominated for another Alfred Hitchcock psychological thriller, Suspicion, playing a wealthy heiress terrified that her charming husband is plotting to murder her. The industry was salivating. The Academy organizers, fully aware of the theatrical potential, seated the sisters at the exact same table at the Biltmore Hotel banquet. The physical proximity was a deliberate act of psychological cruelty. The air at the table was suffocating. Lillian Fontaine was also in attendance, basking in the unprecedented glory of having produced 2 nominees, the ultimate validation of her Saratoga training camp. Yet the underlying tension was lethal. Olivia was the overwhelming favorite to win. She was the established star, the elder sister, the woman who had paid her dues in the Warner Brothers trenches. Even Joan reportedly believed that Olivia's victory was a foregone conclusion. The natural order of their childhood dictated that Olivia must win. When the presenter tore open the envelope, the resulting announcement effectively shattered the foundational law of their family. The winner was Joan Fontaine. The immediate aftermath at the table dissolved into profound psychological paralysis. According to multiple historical accounts and eyewitness testimonies, Joan physically froze. The sheer weight of the moment, the realization that she had just permanently usurped the golden child, triggered a massive internal crisis. Winning the Oscar meant she had committed the ultimate transgression against her mother's established hierarchy. She was terrified of the immediate retaliation. Beside her, Olivia demonstrated the immaculate, aristocratic discipline that Lillian had drilled into her for 2 decades, masking whatever devastation she felt beneath a professional smile. Olivia turned and graciously extended her hand to congratulate her younger sister. It was the precise, expected gesture of a seasoned leading lady. What happened next became Hollywood legend. Joan, trapped in a trance of shock, guilt, and deep-seated fear, stood up and stared blankly ahead. She completely bypassed Olivia's outstretched hand. She did not meet her sister's eyes. She brushed past the gesture, leaving Olivia's hand suspended in midair in front of the entire industry elite, and rushed toward the podium to claim her statue. Joan would later claim in her autobiography that the slight was entirely unintentional, asserting that her mind simply went blank and she never even saw the extended hand. Olivia never believed her. For Olivia, who had spent her life demanding respect and defending her territory, the rejection was a calculated, unforgivable public insult. It was a slap delivered without physical contact, broadcast to the world. The understudy had not only stolen the crown, but she had publicly humiliated the queen in the process. The fragile truce was dead. The ping-pong match of their rivalry had just been struck with a lethal, blinding force, and the ball was now firmly in Olivia's court. While Joan spent the next few years capitalizing on her Oscar victory, starring in atmospheric dramas like Jane Eyre and Letter from an Unknown Woman, Olivia initiated a war that was far more significant than any family squabble. She stopped fighting her sister and began fighting the very machinery that had trapped them both. Her target was Jack L. Warner and the entire system of indentured servitude that governed Hollywood. When Olivia's original 7-year contract expired in 1943, Warner Brothers claimed they had the legal right to extend it by adding the duration of the punitive suspensions she had served for refusing subpar roles. Warner essentially argued that he owned her professional life until she had worked a full 7 years on his specific terms. Instead of capitulating, Olivia did something completely unprecedented for a female star of her magnitude. She sued the studio. This was a deeply dangerous, potentially career-ending maneuver. The studio system blacklisted actors who filed lawsuits. Olivia was removed from the screen at the absolute height of her fame. For 2 agonizing years, she did not make a single film. She poured her resources into the legal battle, demonstrating the unyielding iron constitution that made her such a formidable adversary. In 1944, the California Court of Appeals ruled in her favor, establishing the landmark Labor Code Section 2855, universally known in the industry as the de Havilland Law. The ruling determined that a studio could not enforce a personal services contract beyond 7 calendar years, effectively breaking the monopolistic grip the studios held over their talent. In the 1940s, studio contracts functioned as legalized indentured servitude. Actors were heavily leveraged assets, traded like property between executives. If a star refused a demeaning role, they were suspended without pay. That time was then tacked onto the end of their contract, trapping them indefinitely. By dismantling this practice, Olivia did not merely save her own career. Legal scholars note that she fundamentally emancipated every actor in Hollywood, shifting the balance of power from the corporations to the artists. It was a monumental victory that fundamentally reshaped the economics of the entertainment industry, granting actors the freedom to operate as independent contractors. Olivia had single-handedly brought Jack L. Warner to his knees. She emerged from her exile not just as a star, but as a historic emancipator. With her autonomy finally secured, Olivia returned to the screen with a vengeance, actively seeking out the complex, unglamorous roles she had previously been denied. Her triumphant comeback vehicle was the 1946 drama To Each His Own, in which she played a woman aging from a naive teenager to an embittered middle-aged businesswoman over the course of decades. The performance was a masterclass in controlled, subtle devastation, completely shattering her previous image as the decorative maiden. It earned her an immediate Academy Award nomination for Best Actress. The timing was perfectly aligned for an act of cosmic, or perhaps highly orchestrated retribution. The 19th Academy Awards in 1947 provided the exact stage required to settle the debt incurred 5 years prior. The atmosphere leading up to the 1947 ceremony was remarkably toxic. The hostility between the sisters had curdled into outright hostility, exacerbated by a vicious exchange in the press regarding Olivia's recent personal life. Olivia had married Marcus Goodrich, a fiercely intelligent, combative novelist with a complicated marital history. Joan, never one to let an opportunity for a public dig slip by, was quoted by reporters offering a devastating assessment of her sister's new husband. She reportedly quipped that it was a shame Olivia's husband had collected so many wives, but had managed to write only one book. It was a precise, calculated strike at Olivia's pride, an insult delivered through the megaphone of the Hollywood press corps. Olivia was infuriated. She viewed the comment as a grotesque violation of a final, unwritten boundary. The stage was set at the Shrine Auditorium. Olivia was the favorite once again, but this time the narrative was driven by her historic legal triumph and her profound personal resentment. When Olivia de Havilland's name was announced as the winner for Best Actress, she marched to the stage, claiming the gold statue that validated years of legal exile and artistic frustration. She was radiant, invincible, clutching the Oscar as physical proof of her ultimate supremacy. As she descended the stairs and moved into the backstage press area, the flash bulbs erupting around her, Joan Fontaine was waiting. Joan, perhaps sensing the public relations necessity of displaying familial warmth, or perhaps attempting to genuinely bridge the gap, stepped forward. She extended her hand to congratulate her victorious sister, perfectly mirroring the gesture Olivia had offered her in 1942. The retaliation was instantaneous, surgical, and absolutely devastating. Olivia saw Joan approaching. She saw the outstretched hand. Without a second of hesitation, Olivia physically recoiled. She clutched her Oscar tightly to her chest, drawing her elbows in to create an impenetrable barrier. Then she executed a sharp, deliberate pivot. She turned her entire body away from Joan, offering her sister only her back. She kept walking, leaving Joan standing in the center of the frantic backstage area, her hand extended to empty space, her face crumbling from a forced smile into absolute shock. The moment was captured by a quick-thinking photographer, immortalizing the exact millisecond that de Havilland's Sisterhood officially died. The photograph splashed across every newspaper in the country the next morning. It was a visual execution. Olivia had waited half a decade to return the slap, and she delivered it with an absolute, chilling finality. There would be no more apologies, no more forced table seating, and no more pretending. The abyss had fully opened between them, and neither woman possessed the desire or the psychological tools to ever build a bridge across it. The photograph of Olivia de Havilland turning her back on Joan Fontaine at the 1947 Academy Awards became the defining historical artifact of their relationship. It was syndicated globally, cementing the exact narrative the Hollywood machinery wanted the public to consume. Two vindictive women locked in an eternal catfight. In the golden age of Hollywood, a star's private life was strictly corporate intellectual property. The true architects of this mutual destruction were the narcissistic family system designed by their mother, Lillian Fontaine, and the predatory economics of the 1940s studio apparatus. Lillian Fontaine did not relinquish her control over her daughters simply because they became international film stars. She continued to operate as the supreme emotional authority, utilizing the exact same tactics of triangulation she had perfected in Saratoga. Lillian lived well into her 80s, maintaining a terrifying grip on the family dynamic by functioning as an emotional arms dealer. She would travel to California, take up residence in Joan's home, and spend her time listing Olivia's perceived failures and betrayals. Months later, she would travel to Olivia's residence and perform the exact same operation in reverse, feeding Olivia carefully edited stories about Joan's jealousy and erratic behavior. Lillian ensured she was the sole conduit of information between her daughters. If Olivia and Joan had ever truly united, they would have inevitably compared notes and realized the source of their lifelong agony was the mother pulling the strings. By keeping them locked in a state of perpetual warfare, Lillian guaranteed her own relevance. They spent their entire adult lives fighting for a scrap of maternal approval that Lillian was structurally incapable of providing. The film industry operated as a massive, highly efficient secondary abuser. In the golden age of Hollywood, a star's private life was not personal. It was corporate intellectual property. The studios recognized early on that a bitter sibling rivalry was a highly lucrative marketing campaign that cost them absolutely nothing to produce. When the feud escalated, studio executives at Warner Brothers, RKO, and Selznick International did not attempt to mediate or protect their assets. They poured gasoline on the fire. They deliberately fed blind items to the press. They orchestrated awkward public encounters, knowing the visible tension would translate directly into increased newspaper circulation and higher box office receipts. Gossip columnists like Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons were completely complicit in this psychological violence. They actively directed the feud. They operated as conduits for studio misinformation, calling one sister to relay a fabricated insult supposedly spoken by the other, waiting for the explosive reaction, and printing it the next day. The studios desperately needed their actors to remain insecure. An insecure, emotionally isolated actress is entirely dependent on the studio hierarchy for validation. An actress, consumed by a personal vendetta against her own sister, is highly unlikely to organize a labor strike, demand script approval, or challenge the punitive nature of her contract. Olivia and Joan believed they were fighting a desperate war for personal honor and professional survival. In reality, they were fighting a brutal public war that generated massive profits for men like Jack L. Warner, destroying their only genuine familial connection in the process. Following the brutal public severing at the 1947 Oscars, the relationship degenerated into a multi-decade Cold War. There were brief, entirely superficial periods of détente, usually forced by unavoidable family obligations or public relations necessities, but the fundamental trust was permanently eradicated. They learned to navigate the treacherous waters of Hollywood by ensuring they rarely occupied the same physical space. They constructed entirely separate, mutually exclusive lives. Olivia eventually executed a brilliant escape from the American studio machinery. In the 1950s, she relocated to Paris, marrying a French journalist and establishing herself within the European intellectual elite. She insulated herself from the daily grind of Hollywood gossip, ascending to a level of aristocratic respectability that culminated in her becoming the first female president of the Cannes Film Festival jury. She built an impenetrable fortress of dignity, treating any mention of her sister as a vulgarity completely beneath her notice. Joan remained in California, and her trajectory was markedly different. She lacked Olivia's ironclad emotional defenses. Joan cycled through 4 marriages, constantly seeking the stability and unconditional affection she had been denied in childhood. As she aged out of the fragile ingenue roles that had made her famous, her career faltered. She became increasingly bitter, frequently utilizing the press to deliver sharp, acidic assessments of her sister's life. Joan leaned heavily into the feud, weaponizing her own resentment. She famously remarked to reporters that she had married first, won an Academy Award first, and fully intended to die first, simply because she knew it would infuriate Olivia to be beaten to the grave. It was a tragic, revealing statement. Even in her contemplation of death, Joan's primary frame of reference was her competition with her sister. The final absolute fracture occurred in 1975. Havilland Fontaine died of cancer at the age of 88. In a functional family, the death of a parent often serves as a catalyst for reconciliation, a moment where petty grievances are eclipsed by shared grief. In the de Havilland family, the death of the architect merely triggered the final collapse of the architecture. The events surrounding Lillian's memorial service remain a bitterly contested historical battlefield, featuring 2 mutually exclusive narratives that highlight the total breakdown of communication. Joan immediately seized the narrative, contacting the press to announce a shocking betrayal. She publicly claimed that she had been deliberately excluded from her own mother's funeral. She stated that she had not been informed of Lillian's passing and had only discovered the news by reading a newspaper article. She painted Olivia as a monster of cold-blooded cruelty who had used their mother's death as the ultimate weapon of exclusion. Olivia, operating from her stronghold in Paris, aggressively rebutted the accusation. She maintained that she had immediately sent a telegram to Joan informing her of the death and the funeral arrangements. According to Olivia, Joan had initially dismissed the notification, claiming she had prior social engagements and was simply too busy to attend. The objective truth regarding the telegrams is entirely secondary to the physical reality of the memorial service itself. Despite the vicious public dispute, both women ultimately attended the funeral in California. It was the absolute nadir of their relationship. In a room gathered to mourn the woman who had forged their brilliance and orchestrated their misery, Olivia and Joan operated as if the other simply did not exist. They arrived separately. They sat on completely opposite sides of the chapel. Throughout the entire service, sitting on opposite sides of the chapel, they shared no words, no grief, and no eye contact. When the memorial concluded, they exited through separate doors and returned to their separate lives. It was the last time the two sisters would ever occupy the same physical space. The cord was finally, permanently cut. For the next 38 years, they maintained a regime of absolute unyielding silence. They erased each other from their respective realities. Interviewers were strictly forbidden from raising the subject. Those who dared were met with icy shutdowns or abrupt terminations of the interview. They grew old in completely different worlds. Joan remained in her California estate, fiercely independent bee, but increasingly isolated, surrounded by her dogs and her Oscars. Olivia reigned in Paris, a universally revered icon of the Golden Age, fiercely guarding her legacy and her privacy. The question of who ultimately won the feud is entirely irrelevant. History generally awards the final victory to Olivia simply by virtue of endurance. She outlived her sister, her studio bosses, and all of her contemporaries, passing away in 2020 at the astonishing age of 104. Joan received her dark wish. She died first, passing away in her Carmel home in 2013 at the age of 96. But framing their lives as a scorecard fundamentally misunderstands the nature of their tragedy. Neither woman won. They both lost. They were stripped of the only other human being on earth who possessed the exact same context for their trauma. No one else truly understood what it meant to survive the suffocating expectations of Lillian Fontaine. No one else knew the precise crushing weight of the studio system as it existed in the late 1930s. They were the only two soldiers who had survived the exact same war, yet they spent nearly 80 years firing on each other. They fought a bitter, lifelong battle over a mother's love that never actually existed, manipulated by a system that saw their pain only as profit. The story of Olivia de Havilland and Joan Fontaine remains a stark, terrifying blueprint of how systems of power, whether domestic or industrial, rely on division to maintain absolute control. They turn natural allies into unnatural enemies because united people are impossible to break. The de Havilland sisters faced profound emotional and psychological manipulation, their minds treated as battlegrounds by their mother and their employers. But while they fought their highly publicized war of attrition, another studio was busy perfecting a far more invasive and brutal method of control. This system relied heavily on amphetamines, barbiturates, and the systematic physical breaking of a child's star to ensure maximum industrial output. If you want to hear the darkest reality of the Golden Age, the story of the chemical laboratory that MGM built around a young girl named Judy Garland, comment MGM Dark below.